Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information and free resources, such as articles, case studies, videos, a self-assessment against the standard, and much, much more.
Hi, I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability. Welcome to podcast 4 in a series of 5 podcasts around human rights and supply chains. I'm delighted to introduce Elise Groulx and Helen Carter. Would you like to introduce yourselves, please?
I'm a human rights lawyer. I started my career as a public defender, so my specialty was criminal law and really a public defender in criminal law for many years. I was also involved in the creation of the International Criminal Court, so I became a specialist in international criminal law. But now I work more as a human rights lawyer for the last 10 years, and especially in business and human rights, which is a new field of practice, which is now officially recognized in the legal classification by chambers and partners and other big law firms. So it is a real field of practice, which kind of marries different fields of law. We can get back to that. And I'm also an international mediator. I'm a member of 9 Bedford Row in London. So I think that's a connection to the UK that's worthy of mention. And I am a lawyer licensed in France, in Canada, and also I'm a legal consultant with the New York Bar.
Thanks, Elise. So, Helen, would you like to follow that?
I don't think I can, to be brutally honest.
You can. You're doing yourself down.
But in terms of my experience, I'm obviously part of Action Sustainability. I've known Sean for a very long time because I've been with him virtually from the beginning on this one. I am actually procurement by background. I've sort of spent 3 decades working in procurement and supply chains. So that's the angle that I come to this from my perspective. I've been involved in sustainable procurement for about 20 years, but probably the last 10 ever since I picked up a piece of work for something called the Supply Chain Sustainability School, which some of you may be familiar with. I looked at modern slavery as part of that initially. Very much in those early days started to see it as this is something that's bubbling away and coming, needless to say why we're here today. Over those 10 years, I've been responsible for developing the school's approach to how we help with the construction industry. I've worked alongside businesses to understand how they look at particularly supply chain due diligence and best practice within this space. And this year was the launch of the British standard BS 25700, which is part of a standard, a free standard actually, that BSI have created to help organisations understand what they need to do to deal with modern slavery. I was part of the authoring committee and wrote particularly the procurement element of it. And I have the privilege of being the new head of the shadow committee for the UK for the new ISO standard that's going to be looked at over the next few years. So taking the British standard and taking that on. So whereas Elise has the legal framework, I have less of that, but much more around that sort of supply chain due diligence and engagement space.
Can I ask you both for a view on just transition? That's one of the things that we put in the agenda, and we've kind of touched on it so far. But if maybe I can start with you, Helen. We're hearing this expression, just transition, now quite a lot. I think a lot of people don't know what it means, or there are different interpretations. But what does it mean to you?
I liken this, it's an evolving subject matter. I mean, the first mention of it, I suppose, was the Paris Climate Agreement. And I liken that to a bit of a lazy interpretation, because basically they realised that they needed something to hang on to climate sort of progress. So I thought jobs. Everyone likes a job. Everyone wants that. So let's make it green jobs. And that was sort of the way it started. Really good report to read is the OECD definition in 2017, which actually sort of really expanded that and said, no. Obviously, from a climate perspective, it is this balance, and Elisa alluded to it earlier on. It is this balance of, we have planetary limits, but it is not about trampling on the people to get to be able to deal with these issues. People are one of the stakeholders. And in the OECD document, when it was talking about just transition, it talked about workers' rights, it talked about society rights, it talks about the role of government and the role of cities and communities in able to do this. But what I've seen over the years I've been dealing with this and looking into it is people have tended to latch onto the really easy bits to a certain extent. So, okay, how am I going to deal with fuel poverty? I can bring this into my business strategy and make it a real plus for us in how we engage with, people that have got energy problems, fuel poverty problems. Oh, the jobs is easy. easy because we can use it as a way to upskill and we can tie it into that. Hence why I tend to link it to social value, which is not quite that simple. But I'm still yet to see people who are really thinking about worker rights and human rights in supply chain. Businesses where I've seen just transition strategies, it talks about all of the stuff around the government lobbying, around the community, around poverty, and they won't declare what they're doing around transparency in supply chain. And the issues, if we think about solar panels with the Uyghurs, and it's not just actually China and the Uyghurs, they're in Malaysia, they're in, you've got copper and aluminium and silver, so you've got lots of other regions that need to be considered. I'm not going to talk about the lithium in the batteries, or I am, but no one's going to worry about it. I'm not going to talk about the cobalt that's in the mines because, again, a little bit difficult to do. It's in pretty much anything that is a solution to climate change. And there's a lot of awareness and very little action other than, can I comply with my supply chain? So for me, just transition is literally this sort of idea of, I need a climate strategy, but it has to take into consideration the people, and the people has to cover everything. It has to cover climate debt, poverty, workers' rights, community engagement, government involvement. And then a bit what Elise was alluding to with mediation, you'll get a situation where the solutions make sense. They're not just what I lovingly call green bling. My solution is to plant a tree or to do a solar panel. We can come up with some really constructive solutions to the climate change requirements because they're informed by people who are experiencing the issues. And I think that's eventually where it's getting to. That seems to be the conversation increasing over time.
Thanks, Helen. I agree with everything you said. Just transition is really that. It's making sure that the way you transit, how you transit, when you transit, and with what means and how it's transformative of society is fair, is being done with consultation. You can't say like tomorrow morning there will be no more electricity because we cannot afford it. It's too damaging to the environment. You'll have a revolution on your hands. People, if you tell them, okay, maybe the planet will be cleaner in 30 years, I might not be here in 30 years. I want my job today. I want to be able to live today with my children. So people are not ready for that kind of immense trade-off, which the more we wait, the more it might be necessary. But this is a societal endeavor at the level of the whole planet. And so everybody has to show solidarity and work together. And when you see, especially with the pandemic and the globalization, how social inequality has become just bigger and bigger and bigger, you say, we're not getting it. We're just not getting it. How do you want to ask the poorer to make all the sacrifice while the richer are getting richer? So it is a societal matter. The podcast I did that I think I shared with you, Sean, I called the Just Transition the human face of climate change. It's all about the humans that are going to be living that. Of course, it includes biodiversity. Biodiversity is essential. This is the environment in which we live. But it has to be done fast. In a way, it has to be done in a radical way, but it has to be done in a way where people can continue living. Maybe everybody will have to do sacrifice. So if everybody does sacrifice, they might be ready to do it. But you cannot impose the sacrifice always on the most vulnerable, the weaker, and just get the super rich to be okay. And that applies to country as well as people. Because the poor countries are not the ones creating the pollution. It's big countries like the US and China. And you're asking the small countries to make huge, not only small, because India is not small, but to make huge changes that are extremely costly. And you're not giving them the means to do it. I have a friend who's an environmentalist who told me if we took 0.1% of every financial transaction, we could create a pool of money that would permit everybody to transition. 0.1%, that's like 1% of one. It's 100% of 1%. This is like nothing. This should be the way to go. People, but you need very dynamic politicians. You need politicians that believe in all that. It's a common action. It needs to happen at all levels of society, but again, taking into account people.
I think what's quite interesting as well is this idea of remediation. So there's obviously lots of conversation around climate debt and how much countries should be paying each other in terms of compensation. But when you look at remediation, particularly in the human rights part, it's a basket of solutions. So we get very possessive, particularly in the West, about money and about, profit and everything else. And whilst I think there's still a lot more probing and pushing to do in that space to sort of really get people to cough up a few pennies here or there, there's much more that can be done that goes beyond a purse, beyond paying out batches of money to various countries that could actually deal with the issue of how we upskill, how we invest, how we, So I look at it now and we look at the whole, I think it's the EU critical minerals legislation that's coming in that's designed specifically understanding that actually the other big problem you're having with just transition is not just the human rights, but actually the ability for the West to access. Because over the next few years, literally over the last 3 months, 4 months, I've seen China thinking about rationing what they're going to be giving out in terms of critical minerals to support their own economy. I've seen Chile saying the same thing. They're sitting on an awful lot. I think it's lithium that they're sitting on that they're actually thinking of rationing out and not letting people access to. The minerals and the products that we are looking for. It's like the new oil race. The whole economic structure is now starting to move. So from a business perspective, organizations are going to have to start thinking about resilience to be able to deal with the fact that the solutions are going to get very expensive, and start to think much more in a collaborative model. And I think that needs to happen in a country by country basis as well, in terms of, how do we support emerging economies that want to grow, rather than just thinking it's about writing a blank check. There's opportunities for collaboration. There's opportunities for them to grow as an economy and for us to then obviously get a little bit more security of supply. So we do need people to sort of get off the normal treadmill and think about operating slightly differently. But a lot of what I've seen around the climate change, it just seems to be a great big bun fight over who's more responsible than who. And, we just need something to help us and we're not going to pay you. It's a bit like kindergarten watching some of them sometimes. So I think as we get closer, hopefully they will get a bit more inventive about the ways that they're looking at doing things.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And this quest for metal, I mean, you can, there's a movie that was released, I think, by Arte, the Franco-German TV called Cobalt. Yes. And I commend it to you. I mean, you should look at it. You should see how still today cobalt that comes from the center of DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, is being harvested. I mean, it's a public scandal. We need cobalt to make these phones. These phone companies are making such a huge profit. I cannot believe they cannot ensure that these workers and these children are living in decent conditions, since they bring the metal that we all need. I mean, it seems unbelievable that it's still happening to that large extent.
There's a massive issue here, and this is where it needs to get a bit more interconnected, because again, the work that I'm doing on solar panels at the moment, we're looking about circularity and end of life as a way to be able to reduce that reliance. And I think there is a slight shift now, and I don't think it's anything to do with human rights, unfortunately. I think it's more to do with scarcity and cost. But we are starting to see that circularity of conversation. I think as much as we laud the younger generation as being much more responsible in this space, there's still, unfortunately, an element of it being very diverse around people still wanting their apples, still wanting their best tech. And actually, the reality is that consumption, I mean, this comes back to the very beginning in terms of exactly what sustainability is about, is much more responsible consumption. And the need and programming that we instill in our kids and our families of, I have to have the best everything now, and we don't make things last. We don't go, and it's an age-old problem that we've been dealing with for such a long time. But now it's much more at the forefront, because we get these abuses because people want to consume. So consumer behavior fundamentally becomes a really important part. Where we do see a real problem, though, is where consumers don't see what's being provided because it's hidden in industries like construction, like manufacturing. If it's a brand, there's a real puller. If there's no brand, that almost gives us a shield to some of these companies because there's nothing to really look at. So it's a huge challenge.
On a positive note or optimistic note, apparently lithium is highly recyclable, or these batteries are highly recyclable. So that will be a new industry, is the recycling of all these different components, these different equipments, this technology. I do believe, I'm a strong believer in the creativity of the human mind and the human spirit. And I believe that the technology might already be where we want it to be. But the problem is the politicians who are not keeping up and who have a vested interest often not to keep up. When I look at these extreme right-wing politicians in the US who are still climate deniers, when climate events are happening in their states in the US, and if they didn't have the blue states to get them out of trouble each time, they would be sinking or burning. So it's absolutely damning to see how people are not fighting for their own interest in the longer term. They only look at very short term. That's another issue: short term versus long term.
Definitely.
And corporations are usually focused on the very short term return and short term action.
And I think sort of the final point for me, I am usually glass half full rather than glass half empty, I like to think. But the reality, I think, as well, is that what we're starting to look at is the innovation. But that innovation comes from people understanding the implications of what they're procuring and what they're buying. So understanding that if I have this is a problem with lithium, this is a problem, and actually challenging industry to do something with it. And I think if we can get people to have much more of a conversation around the holistic procurement, i.e. it's saving an issue climate here, but it has these footprints, then actually we will start to see. So I know with batteries, for example, people have gone back to school and produced salt batteries that could potentially work, that have a massive benefit. Could we upscale that? Could we incentivize that? Could we develop that? That's the government responsibility to try and help build those industries. And that's where I'm a little less optimistic sometimes. But I think the innovation itself, if you put in there, these are the problems, and you give that holistic picture, we will start to get much more rounded solutions to these things. And I think, that's what we obviously all try and do as much as we possibly can in our day jobs.
On the note of optimism, I feel that being a human rights lawyer and the world that we live in, you have to be at least partially a dreamer, because sometimes you really wonder why you're doing that when everything seems to be going so poorly. When that war in Ukraine started, I thought, geez, unbelievable that we're there today. And when Trump was elected, it was like a massive, to me, it was a massive disaster. I knew what would be coming. The only thing I had not seen coming was the level of the cruelty. And the cruelty is like, basically, it's the principle. So, but I have seen so many activists in so many countries, like, keeping at it, fighting every day. And that's so remarkable that brings back the optimism. And the courage of the activist is unparalleled. And it's especially true in the Black community in the US. It's to see how these people are really devoted at fighting every day. They don't have a choice because the unfairness is so huge.
Yeah.
But we won't have the solution today, but I think it's important to have these conversations and to expand the group with whom we're having these conversations. And circular economy is certainly something that's starting to be very popular, and people realize they have to consume locally and produce locally. My worry is that we're going to be forgetting about these regions that we have pulled out of poverty, like Bangladesh with textile, and Pakistan and other countries, Cambodia and even Turkey. And that we need to think about that. We cannot just continue closing in on ourselves, saying, okay, we're okay in this territory, while forgetting all the others. It's yet another balancing act.
Definitely. And I think what businesses need to be able to do is understand where they can work with supply chains to really improve conditions and ensure that people so Rana Plaza was a great example. Primark in the UK is lauded for lots of challenges. They're very cheap. There's a whole issue around disposable fashion. But if you look at what they did working with the victims and their families, it's a really good example of where a business goes, I'm not pulling because there's problems. I'm staying here and working. And in the main, that should be the first issue and not the last issue. So if you can can go in there and improve and enhance and really bring some benefit by you being there, then you stay and you develop. If you cannot do that and that's out of your hands and there's a bigger geopolitical conversation going on, which we know there are, then it's the heightened due diligence that you need to be looking at. Can I stay there? And if so, how do I do it responsibly? You know, getting businesses to think about human rights due diligence is one thing. Explaining heightened due diligence to them in this idea of a responsible, you know, withdrawal from these organizations would be, you know, you need to employ a lot of people to help you do that. And that's still probably not enough case studies around to be able to show how organizations have really done that really well. But yeah, I mean, we talk a lot. When I talk a lot to my clients, it's usually, you know, the first thing you do is it's continuous improvement. You work with, you don't just retract and withdraw. Where that is not possible, then there will be a point you can walk away, but you still have to do that responsibly.
I agree. I agree with that too. I mean, I think I gave a talk with Phil Bloomer. I'm sure you all know Phil Bloomer from the Business and Human Rights Resource Center on climate change and human rights in London in October. I didn't know you then, Sean or Helen, so if not, I would have invited you. But we were of the same mind. We were talking to a public of investors, of bankers, of asset managers. We were talking to ourselves, saying, who would have thought that you and I would be talking to a public of investors? But we were trying to convince them that they had huge leverage and they were not aware of the leverage they had, that they could use their leverage to make a real difference. And they cannot just come into a project and not look at these issues, because if not, they become accomplice to the abuse that are taking place both on the planet and on people. But it's encouraging that I was invited in Hong Kong at the end of March to talk to investors about these issues. To me, it's a little encouragement to think that these issues are traveling in very different milieu now, and that people want to know. The people in Hong Kong were extremely educated, very well informed. They had tons of questions. The events lasted extra hours because of the questions, but I was very happy to be able to have that conversation with them. And I think, again, we need to be encouraged where we can, because if not, it's too discouraging. But we need to be inclusive, and inclusive in the sense of not forgetting the global south. I mean, I think that's fundamental in our effort to save our own little corner of a country. I believe it needs absolutely global solutions. I mean, local solutions are not going to do the trick. You need to have both, but you need to have global solutions that are going to work with local areas.
So, Elise and Helen, thank you very much for giving your perspective on just transition and how you feel we all need to work together towards a zero carbon economy in a way that's fair to everybody. I do hope our listeners enjoyed that session. This is podcast 4 of 5 about human rights, sustainability and supply chains. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on sense and sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.